the most heroic thing you can do is not hate yourself.
Sometimes people who try to do good things, they have like this shadow. They feel that they're not good enough, or they feel that they're insecure in some way. And there's just some amount of self-loathing.
Until you integrate your shadow into yourself, you will look upon the things that happen to you and call them fate.
The reason you want to be better is the reason why you're not.
What is this trying to improve? The reason that you're trying to do that is that you don't understand that you're fine, but you're fine right now.
And if you haven't laughed in a while, that's a sign something's not right. And anybody who cannot stand being made fun of, they're insecure in some way.
One of my mantras is, I like to look for things to root for as opposed to against.
If you think someone isn't creative, look at their excuses. I want people to question defaults and, more importantly, give each other space to like screw around and try something different.
Well, hello everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with take 2 of welcoming you to Infinite Loops. My longtime viewers and listeners know that sometimes being an old, I forget to hit record. And Visa, my guest, who I'm going to introduce you to in a minute, was like already giving this incredible answer to a question, but now he's had the practice round. Maybe it'll even better. That's not the way I think about it. My guest today is Visakan Veerasamy. I got that pretty close. I was absolutely drawn to you via Twitter. And you do such a great job with threads. You do the stuff you put up, like your memex, everything is connected. Like I could be on your feed forever. And so after looking into you and reading your books, I thought people really need to know you. And that's why I wanted you to come on as a guest. So first off, we're going to talk about your first book, which you titled A Friendly, Ambitious Nerd, which I really liked because of the way you played with words that don't normally go together. Friendly, I myself have tried to do that most of my adult life. Your point is that being friendly, you cultivate an abundance mindset in yourself, which I have found to be absolutely true. I have no problem going up to total strangers, starting a conversation with them. My wife, a little more introverted than I am, and she's like, don't do that. I mean, there was a guy when I was in Miami, this is a long time ago, he was smoking a vape, right? And I'd never seen one. And of course, he fit the doorman role. He was heavily tattooed, kind of like biker vibes and everything, with the beard and kind of bald. And I got to go ask him. And she's like, no, don't do that. Turns out to be like the nicest guy in the world. Ended up talking to him for 45 minutes. And like, why are you doing that? He's like, my old lady, man. She said, if I didn't quit smoking, I was out. She found a way in. So it's wonderful what you can find. Ambitious. I love that too, because most people think ambitious, they think, I'm ambitious and I'm going to conquer. And really what you're using it as a term for is it helps you create an abundance mindset, which I think we'll get into it. I think we're actually, hopefully, at a transitionary point in our human species where we might be able to move towards more abundance mindsets. And then nerd, for the second time. When I was growing up, I'm 62, so I'm tail end of the baby boom. Nerd was not necessarily a positive thing to be called. But when I read your definition, which was basically, if you are deeply driven by curiosity, you are by definition a nerd. So Visa, welcome to the Nerd Zone.
Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in and talk about your first book. What drove you to write it? Why the title? I'm fascinated by all of this.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah. So I've always loved writing, reading, knowledge, books. So even before the internet, I spent all my time in libraries. My mom would have to drag me out. And when I discovered the internet, I was drawn to it immediately because I thought, wow, this is like a super library and I can participate directly. I can, publish my own thoughts. And so I was always blogging, posting in forums, just spending as much time as I could online. And people liked it. So people would say things like, hey, we love your comments. We love your blog posts. Are you going to write a book someday? Like, we would love to read your book. And I was, ecstatic because I do want to write a book. But I remember being very torn up about, well, whatever is your first book is going to define you in some way. It's going to be the thing that people introduce you as. Here is so-and-so, he's the author of this book. And so, I had played music. I had in a band when I was a teenager. I had worked in software marketing. I was interested in all kinds of things, but I didn't really want my debut offering to be, some guide to marketing or guide to living with ADHD. Or, I even wrote a draft of a novel, which is like about a bunch of teenage musicians in a music scene, very autobiographical. But none of those I felt was compelling as a debut offering. And so what I did was I would ask people who said that they wanted to read my book, okay, you tell me that you like my writing. When you introduce me to your friends, how do you introduce me? Or like, when you share my work, how do you describe it? This is kind of like my marketing brain at play. And they would say, oh, Visa is always so encouraging. He's always talking about the power of friendship. And he's always encouraging people to be more prolific and do more stuff. And he's always so curious and nerdy. And so I just kind of made a list of all the things that people would say about me that I liked. And then I assembled them into a bunch of buckets and then just kind of move stuff around. And I'm like, there's all this stuff about being a good friend. There's all this stuff about being more ambitious. And there's all this stuff about being curious. And so, yeah, I just moved stuff around and I figured I would love to be introduced to people as a friendly, ambitious nerd. And I felt like it's also an ideal to live up to. I think there's like a soft version of the idea, which is like, oh, you're just kind of friendly. Oh, you're just kind of ambitious. Oh, you're just kind of curious, which is fine, which is nice. But I have, and I don't know if I did justice to this in the first edition of the book, but it's definitely going to be a bigger part of the second edition, which is that there's like a strong version of it or like a hardcore version of it. Where when I say friendly, I don't just mean, pleasant to be around socially, but like really actively working to kind of organize events, build community, host dinner parties, like being like a super connector. And when I say ambitious, I don't necessarily mean prestige seeking, wanting a lot of money and power and influence, but more of like wanting to express your taste and your values at the highest possible level, whatever that means for you, like just really expanding and being sensitive. And when I talk about nerds, I talk about, being driven by your curiosity, driven by your taste. And I really like my definition because I feel like you can even say the more of a person's behavior is directed by their curiosity, the bigger of a nerd they are. So, you can be like a casual weekend nerd, which is fine. Or, some people pack up their lives to study butterflies in the Amazon rainforest, right? Like that's a huge nerd. And I like how that kind of, it introduces the thing I really enjoy about having written my book is that I started out just trying to write about myself and share ideas that people had already liked. But once I pieced it together, I started to see that it actually kind of functions as a lens or a framework to examine the world with. And I found, to my surprise so Aristotle had this whole model of ethos, logos, and pathos. And I'm like, wait, that kind of logo, it kind of fits in the same tripartite kind of model. Like just being warm and human in one way, being very kind of rational and curious and tinkering in another way, and being kind of a man of action in another. So it's the same thing. So it's like, wow, I'm great. I'm so happy that there's like this kind of timeless quality to the thing that I had just cobbled together. And my current preoccupation is I have been wanting to investigate who have been the friendly ambitious nerds throughout history, right? So like people who, and I've been doing my reading, I found like when Einstein was doing his stuff, he would hang out at Max Planck's house. So Max Planck and his wife, they would host these dinner parties, and Einstein and all these other physicists, they would show up, they would play music, and they would have that whole scene going. And these like scene managers and connectors, they are like underappreciated in creating it, I don't know if it's like creating, but like catalyzing the scenes where like great value happens and just learning and delight. And so, I feel like the book I wrote it, yeah, but it's almost like I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time to connect some dots. And it feels like it's something bigger than me. I've shared it online it's been a couple of years now, and I keep encountering people who really resonate with the idea. And so I almost feel like I'm the custodian of the idea, sort of. Like and because it's a natural language, it's not like I made up a word. I'm using existing words in a certain way. People like to contribute their suggestions and their perspectives, which I find very enjoyable because you get it. Yeah.
Yeah. And like there's so much in your reply that I noticed too. You use philosophy a lot. I was a fan of philosophy, read most of the major philosophers. I like the way that you use it because you use it as a way to illustrate the point you're trying to make, right? So you're not like in quotes an Aristotle nerd, but you know about the ancient Greek idea of arete, and Aristotle's multi-part model, which kind of made me think of Walt Whitman. I contain multitudes, and we all do, I think. And the thing that I like about how that led into your second book, which was Introspect, uh, where you had a line which really grabbed me, which was the most heroic thing you can do is not hate yourself. Elaborate, please.
Thank you for asking. Yeah, I think, where do I start with this? So it's funny because with Introspect, I did not expect the book to kind of swell into the massive project that it became. I thought it would be fairly small. I just, again, it's the same kind of bottom up thing where I would have lots of conversations with people in my DMs, for example, and they would ask me for like simple life advice and stuff. And I just have a lot of practice. And when I was a teenager, I used to read a lot of like advice columns and magazines and stuff. So it's not that I'm exceptionally wise or anything. I just happen to be like a switchboard for a lot of wisdom from elsewhere. But routinely I would get people telling me, "Oh, we chatted like 6 months ago, and like that chat kind of changed my life a little bit, and I've been doing better." And I would receive dozens of people saying things like that, and so I found myself thinking, "Wow, if I can have this effect on dozens of people, wouldn't it be nice if I put together something more coherent and shared it with even more people? Then I could help maybe thousands of people." But it turns out that writing a book is much harder than having a conversation. But anyway, so your question was about the most heroic thing is to not hate yourself. Yeah. Um, I have found, and I've always been fascinated by success stories and biographies and just the stories of people, right? And people who've accomplished great things and people who have struggled and so on. And a recurring motif I've found is that sometimes people who try to do good things, they have like this shadow. And again, the language is kind of tricky, but like there's a part of them that resents some part of themselves. They feel that they're not good enough, or they feel that they're insecure in some way, and there's just some amount of self-loathing. It's a common feature in a lot of like hyper accomplished individuals. And it's not, and I don't want to say that it's a horrible thing, but it's a thing that's like, and I'm sure anybody who's like, any parent surely recognizes this. Anybody who runs a company will surely recognizes this. It's like whatever our own internal anxieties and worries and struggles will end up kind of coming out in ways that we can't anticipate, and it will end up shaping the culture. If it's an organization, it ends up shaping the organization's culture. If it's your family, it ends up shaping your family's dynamics. So it's like, and that usually ends up, sometimes or often ends up having like pretty bad consequences because the person can't really see it. It's like in their blind spot. And again, I won't claim to be like wise. I'm I'm still figuring out my own life, but I just found that, and I think I got part of this idea from Kenny Werner, who's a jazz pianist, and he has this wonderful masterclass on YouTube where he's just lecturing to a bunch of jazz musician students, and he was saying things like, the most beautiful sounds that you can make are when you accept what is happening perfectly in the moment, and there's no self-judgment, and there's no, kind of, you play a note, and so he does this thing where he puts his entire hand on the piano, so it plays like all the discordant, jangly sounds, and he presses it all at once, and he goes, "How beautiful that sounds," and then he starts playing something that kind of goes with it and makes it work. And I found that to be so just mind-blowing in some ways, heart expanding, and multiple musicians and artists have said things like that. Like, you know, when you've made a mistake, quote unquote mistake, it's the flinching around the mistake that designates it as a mistake, and the audience feels that it's a mistake. Whereas if you just play a note and it's not the note you wanted, you can flow into the next note in a way that makes it still work. And if you flow smoothly enough, it's like a spicy note. It doesn't seem like a mistake. So it's your own flinching and aversion that designates a mistake as a mistake. Otherwise, you can just. So Victor Wooten says you can erase the mistake by making music with it, which is like, it's very profound when you witness it and you feel it. You feel that acceptance of the mistake. And I think this really generalizes beyond music to like all human relations. It's like if you're feeling awkward and you just kind of, hey, I'm feeling kind of awkward, I'm feeling kind of nervous. Like if you just tell the truth and you're accepting of that feeling, everyone can relax. Whereas, if you're tense, but you don't want to admit that you're tense, then everyone around you gets doubly tense. And so, yeah, like when you lay out all of those things around the table and you look at them, you're like, the problem is that when there is someone attempting to do heroic action, which is noble, I would say, and something, worth encouraging, it's the ways in which the hero is, self unaccepting or self-loathing, right? That really is where when there is damage, that's where the damage happens. And so, yeah, I do think that the most heroic thing you can do is, so I say not hate yourself because it sounds a bit, kind of spicy, but it's really just really accepting who you are and accepting where you are. And so another thing that Kenny Werner says is that when people go to see beautiful musicians and artists and dancers performing, half of it is, oh, we want to see someone who's very technically competent and skilled at their craft. But like at least the other half, maybe more, is you want to see someone who's in the zone and they're so accepting of whatever is happening and they're letting it happen. And there is something about that self-acceptance that's almost divine, almost like godly in its acceptance. And we all want a taste of that because so many of us are going about our day-to-day lives kind of feeling like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, no, I'm not working hard enough. And that can have you get tense and then you get closed up and it's just not great. Whereas when you're relaxed and loose, people like to hang out and it's just great vibes.
So like we could spend the entire rest of the podcast just talking about what you just said. I met many thoughts. When you were talking a bit about the music and relaxing, I'm a huge music fan, and I have music on all day long. And typically it's Baroque and Bach when I'm working, and then it is the gambit, classic rock, EDM, like literally everything. And I completely share your idea that there is a magic in music. And it made me think of the poem by T.S. Eliot, Portrait of a Lady, where they're talking about going to hear the latest pole transmit the preludes, that's Chopin, through his hair and fingertips. So intimate is Chopin that he should not be questioned or rubbed in, I can't remember the exact line, and questioned in the concert room. And I always loved that line because it spoke to me, as you just said, with the music and the idea of just letting yourself experience it, right? And the second thing that you inspired is this notion of, we all have Kapil Gupta. I've read all of his books, and he's got an interesting thing in there where he says he's working with a client, and the client is saying, I am so angry. And he says, why are you angry? And the client says, well, somebody told me I was dumb. And he goes, huh, okay. And that makes you angry? Yes, I'm furious. And he goes, well, I think you're an ugly horse. And the client is taken aback and looks at him and says, what? And he goes, I think you're an ugly horse. And the client says, whatever, dude, that makes no sense to me. And then he goes, there's the lesson. if you get insulted by something someone else says about you, there is at least a small part of you that agrees with what they're saying. It's virtually impossible to be insulted if not a single fiber of your being, if somebody calls me an asshole or whatever, and if I don't think anywhere in my being that is a case, you just go, you're unaffected. And finally, Tony DeMello, another big, I'm a huge fan of Tony DeMello, and he says that, paraphrasing, he says, if you want to know what your own shortcomings are, look at what irritates you in others. And I love that, because I've always had this idea that we are not bad. We're not great, but we're not bad at like assessing another human, right? We suck at self-assessment. All of us, myself included. Like, I'm not trying to say I am the only exception. I'm not. I'm running human OS just like everyone else. And so that really resonates with me in terms of the, you got to try, it's a very Taoist concept, right? Because and Jung, right? He says, until the shadow, that's the part of us that all of us have too. Good observation, right? Jung is always like, until you integrate your shadow into yourself, you will look upon the things that happen to you and call them fate. And what Jung was trying to get across was, we are all writing our own script here. And you've got to accept that you have it. He called it the shadow. You call it a minotaur. I mean, there's all sorts of, there's a lot of different histories of Gollum, all of these things. And one of the things that you say that syncs up really well with a former guest and somebody who I've devoured his entire catalog, Will Storr, wrote in a book called Scientific Storytelling. And Will says, listen, we're all confabulating unreliable narrators, forever writing our own story. And what he points out is, of course, we want to be the hero of our own story, unless like we have a real problem mentally. We want to do that. And so when I was reading your stuff, of course, I'm a huge Joseph Campbell nerd, but you talk about the hero's journey, and enter the labyrinth, that's going down to the side that you might not like. And I think of the Campbell line, the treasure you seek is in the cave you fear to enter. And then you basically call it confronting the minotaur, right? And I'm going to let you talk about that. But, spoiler alert, the minotaur, which scares us so deeply, it turns out if you really, really look, what you find is a child. Talk about that.
Yeah, man, I had such an emotional experience writing that part of the book, and so I actually got a tattoo of a classic labyrinth on my
I
neck
love it.
after
I noticed.
right?
I love it.
Yeah, after I published the book, and I remember I would struggle to write the book. So the first book I wrote fairly easily. I was just just going off the cuff. But the second book, because it's so intimate and talking about like going into one's emotional depths, I would get tired just thinking about the book sometimes. Sometimes I would wake up in the morning, I'd have my coffee and sit down ready to write. And I would write like a couple of lines, and then I would feel like, oh my God, I gotta take a nap. I can't work. And then I would go out and lie on the sofa and take a nap. And I would have these vivid dreams. And only in retrospect, after publishing the book, did I realize I must have been like processing my own like childhood feelings and all kinds of stuff. And yeah, so it's just, in so many stories, and even in modern media, right? So like in Encanto, there's this thing about we don't talk about Bruno, which is like one character in the family who's like the dark horse who's cast out of the family. And not just, even in like Thor Ragnarok, like Hela, the sister, she was the dark horse of the family. And in so many, even in Frozen, Elsa kind of locks herself up. Like there's this recurring thing in families and in individuals where there's some part of the self or some part of the family that's considered shameful or has done something wrong and grotesque and must be locked away or not spoken of and put away, right? So, and even in the original story of the Minotaur, it's the child of a forbidden love between the king's wife, and it's just cursed and all kinds of tragic things. And I have these pictures of one is a picture of a drawing of the Minotaur on like this ancient vase, right? And you can see the mother nursing the Minotaur child, and the mother looks so angry and like resentful towards the child. And you just, so often we look at the Minotaur as an image and we think, oh, what a monster, how scary, how, inhuman and evil. But, in that image, you see a child and it's being like, it's not receiving love from the mother. And there's another drawing by someone, I don't even know who the person is, but I linked them in the book. They redrew that exact drawing, but the Minotaur's mother is loving and nourishing and cuddling the cute baby Minotaur. And I just really got the sense of we can choose to walk into the labyrinth and face the Minotaur. And, I guess in the classic telling of the story, the hero kills the Minotaur. And in my retelling, it's like, you don't necessarily have to murder. So like Abraham Lincoln said, I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends, right? Like, so you destroy the cruelty and the neediness and the fear associated with the Minotaur, but it's us. It's our repressed child self. It's that which we think is shameful and bad and wrong. And also, I would want to say, the Minotaur is in the labyrinth kind of for a good reason. The original act of repression, and now I'm reminded even in Black Panther, right? Like Killmonger is sort of the Bruno / like it's the father says he was the truth I chose to omit, right? Like the dark horse of the family. Yeah. When you kind of try to protect the whole by ousting the scapegoat or the black sheep, it's understandable why that decision might be made in the moment, but it has, like there's a debt to it, and it will come back to collect. And so it makes sense for people in their everyday lives to put away their traumas and their fears and their anxieties in a box under the in the basement in lock and key. Like, I don't want to face that. I got bills to pay. I got work to do, right? And that's very reasonable. And usually in a person's present state, if you just try and confront that stuff on an average day, it's going to overwhelm you. It's like, oh my God, like I'm just trying to do my to-do list at work. And suddenly I'm reminded of a fight I had with my dad when I was 12. Like, and now I'm a mess and I can't work, right? So you kind of, it's almost like you have to schedule the surgery, sort of, right? You have to set aside time to process those feelings and thoughts about, even things like teenage dreams that were given up that you haven't thought about in years. That if you don't address it, it will, like Young said, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, because it's just like background, just this sort of a shadow function effect. And another way I like to think about all of this is the conscious self who is going about the day, it's sort of like the monarch of the self, or like the CEO of the self, right? The boss. And what happens when the boss is a shitty manager of the team? In this case, in this analogy, the team is your subconscious selves, your drives, your desires, fears, whatever. If you're not a good manager, people won't tell you the truth as much, and so they'll wait until the manager is not around, and then they'll do whatever they have to do. And so if you're not taking time for leisure, for example, a lot of people have reported doing it's a phrase that started in China. It's called revenge bedtime procrastination. And a lot of people do this where throughout the workday or whatever, they're busy. And then they feel like at night when they're tired, they have to steal time and recreation and leisure away. When the boss is, like not fully there, then they have to steal that recreation. And it's, it's not fulfilling. It's not pleasurable. It's like slightly pleasurable, but it's not, it's tragic when you, on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But when you look back on your life over like a decade and you realize, oh, I spent my entire 20s, never allowing myself to have fun. But then when you examine closely, it's not like you were productive 24/7. No, you're productive for a while. And then there's all this, sneaking around stuff. And it happens really below the level of consciousness. So to be confronted with it can be unpleasant. And sometimes when, in relationships, right, a lot of fights between like husband and wife, it's like one partner observing what the other partner does in that shadow state. And that other person gets resentful and angry because they might not even realize that they're doing it. And so they might feel like, no, I don't have a spending problem. I don't have a drinking problem. Like, screw you. Right. So that's very tricky. And it takes a lot of grace and sensitivity to be like, I'm going to allow space for these feelings that I don't even know about. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that last bit because I agree. And it's something we're going to talk about journaling later because I'm a
Mhm.
massive fan of journaling.
Nice.
I've been doing it since I was 18, and if I could show you around here, it's surrounded by just journals of mine.
Wow.
What's great about it is that I was writing notes to myself without realizing I was doing that. And then when you have enough of a body of work, like in my case, it was, I don't know, I started going back and reading journals I'd written when I was 18, when maybe I was 28. So maybe 10 years. And wow, like all of that kind of stuff emerges. And you mentioned a lot of Disney Pixar movies there. We're going to get to your favorite movies in a bit. But I also, of course, think of Beauty and the Beast,
Mm. Yeah.
where the beast, of course, is this marvelous human being who was cursed, and so I'm involved with the company Stability AI, which is an open AI company, and one of the things that we're going to do is hopefully collect all of the world's stories from every culture, and then set the AI loose on them because we think that there are certainly themes and threads that we humans can see, but it's very difficult for us to look into latent spaces. And we think that there might be a tremendous amount of information in the overlaps in the latent spaces that we're not aware of. And so it'll be a bit of a discovery because I think, you call it an inner tyrant. And
Mm.
there's different names for it. I'm a big fan of the fictional character known as Jed McKenna, who is, in quotes, a spirituality writer. He's not a spirituality writer. But what he is he's seeking enlightenment, or what he calls human adulthood. And one of his motifs is he calls what you call the inner tyrant, he calls the little bastard within. And
Mm.
what he means by that is all of these shadows, right? And Jed says, you know what? Like, when you start to realize that the inner bastard is in there saying, "Let me out of this cage," he goes, that's why you're reading this book.
Mm.
Reading this book because your inner bastard came along and said, "Listen, man, you're fucked up. You got to integrate these personalities." And it's not easy work, and it's not necessarily pleasant work. But like it's so liberating
Mm.
when and if you kind of get into that vibe, right?
Yeah.
And which kind of leads me to a question though. It's like I loved reading this book, but one of the first things I thought was like, how high on the Maslow hierarchy of needs do you have to be before you can even start this? Do you have advice for people who are like worried about losing their job, or with more basic concerns? You're familiar with the hierarchy, of course.
Yeah. I'm thinking.
Food, shelter, love, etc. And then he gets all the way to the top and he calls it self actualization. There's a bunch of different names. But I always try to think, okay, so what about a person who, for whatever reason, is like maybe not up there? How do they do it?
So I again, I'm not an expert or any of that, any of those things, but I'm kind of skeptical about the very linear nature of the hierarchy.
I
Like,
love that. I love that you say that because I agree.
right?
But
Yeah, like
but it is such a culturally
sticky,
well socialized
right?
idea that if you wanna cut to the chase,
Mhm.
you refer to it. But I love the fact that you're like, yeah, that's a bit linear.
That's
But
my
continue.
instinct. Yeah.
But continue.
Yeah, I think that, so there's a quote from Jeanette Winterson where she said something like, she had a hard life. She was like adopted and like struggled with her adoptive mom and all those things. And she said something like, some people describe poetry as though it's some airy-fairy luxury thing for like the, bourgeois, I don't know what class, like upper classes to debate about. But for her, she felt that poetry was tough. It was for people who needed meaning and people who were struggling with their identity and their sense of self. And these working class people, and similarly, like in India, for example, like there's even poor people will go to watch movies, and a bit of it is escapism, I'm sure. But like, I do think that it's a universal human thing to need some amount of I don't know if I want to call it self-actualization, but to need meaning in their lives. There's this sense in which so I care about Singapore history, for example. And in the earliest days when it was just migrants from abroad, people who left China, left India, and they were leaving poverty and starvation and political issue, like, terrible conditions. So they came here to make a living, but they would have like drama troops, and there were many drama troops, and like way more than I expected. And like, why? It's like I'm of the view that like art, poetry, some of it might be kind of frivolous, but I think when it's good, it gives you meaning on the inside of your life. That I can talk about this for hours. And Ethan Hawke has a great thing where he says that the average person doesn't really care about like what is meaning and beauty and whatever. But then your dad dies, or you break up with someone, and someone betrays you, and you're thinking, wow, I feel terrible, and has anyone ever felt this horrible before? Or maybe you fall in love and something's beautiful and beatific, and you're like, your heart is like spewing out of your body, and you're like, has anyone ever felt this amazing before? Like, what's going on? I don't feel normal. And in those moments you realize like artists are there for you. Like they have made the movies and the books and the music. And yeah, again, you might not need it day to day, but at weddings, when people cry, it's usually when the music starts playing, and when there is calamity, right? After tragedies, people sing to mourn. And so I'm very passionate about one of my favorite essays. It's not really an essay, it's a speech by Carl Polnack of the Boston Conservatory to the freshmen who are going to learn music at that place. He was saying, what we do here, we are like spiritual chiropractors. He said, if you were an emergency room surgeon, or in first aid, if someone comes in at 3 a.m. in the morning and their body is broken, like your job is to put them back together again. And similarly, like you might not feel it, but as a musician, someone's gonna come into your concert hall who is weary and despondent. And the story that he said his most important concert that he ever gave was not at Carnegie Hall or any major thing. He once performed for like World War II veterans at some place, and he was performing a piece that was written by a vet about someone who had lost his like buddy in a firefight or something. And there was and he didn't even know this, I think, about the song. Like he was just performing it, and there was a vet who was just weeping openly. And later on, he discovered that vet also lost a compatriot in war. And how astounding it is that something like music can really, and so in his speech, he quotes like the ancient Greeks and how they said like, oh, physics is about like the relationships of the outer world, and music is the relationships of the inner thing. And yeah, so I mean, and so now I'm talking about music, but I think even in talking about like spiritual wellness, and again, I don't mean spiritual in like this very metaphysical sense. I mean like meaning and identity, who you are, what your life is about. Like even when people are struggling to put food on the table, I believe they still have dreams. They still have concerns. And so it's difficult. So it's harder. You don't have spare time to do yoga, and you might not have time for all of that. But and that's difficult. I empathize with, I haven't personally suffered like deprivation to the point where I know how terrible things could be. But at my worst, when I was like a military conscript and extremely broke, I still cared about, I wanted to dream, right? Like, because especially when your circumstances are bleak, like this quote about like man is, between ape and God, or like we are in the gutter and dreaming at the stars, right? Like it's that something about that yeah, I guess I'm a full stack Maslow's hierarchy kind of thinker, right? I feel that everyone needs at least a bit of everything. Like if you impoverish someone and you take away their meaning and their sense of belonging in community and in however broad you want to think about it, like then it's very difficult. So that's where I'm at.
So again, we just sync up on so much. It's really funny because like I have loved music since I was a kid. I was the youngest, the martini baby. Thanks, mom and dad, for having those martinis. There's 7 years between me and my next sibling, and most of my siblings were women. So I came into the world bossed around by four wonderful women. That's why I know all the lyrics to the Supreme songs because they had music on all the time. But I also loved poetry from a young age. My dad was a big poetry nut, and I was like transfixed when he would recite poems. So I decided, okay, I'm going to show him. I'm going to go memorize 100 poems, which I did. And like it comes after, right? Because they mash up together, right? And they synthesize, which creates new knowledge at a level that neither one of them alone might have. But I also was thinking as I was listening to you, I'm a big fan of the book Shantaram. Have you read Shantaram?
Yeah.
Right. So Apple TV did a reasonably good series based on Shantaram, and I won't go into the plot lines and everything, but there is a gangster who our protagonist ends up working for. In the beginning, he doesn't really realize he's working for him, but the protagonist is this wonderfully erudite and well-read person. And one of the things that he continually remarks to the protagonist is all of life's solutions can be found in Shakespeare. And like I love Shakespeare. I've read all of his plays, I've read all the sonnets, and like he's an amazing dude. But I love the way you put it together and they jumble together because you did the Oscar Wilde quote there. All of us are in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars, right?
Yeah.
And that notion is very appealing to me because like everyone can dream and everyone deserves to dream. Everyone should be able to dream. And again, as I listen to you, I think of Will Storr again, who wrote a great book called The Status Game. It's about prestige seeking and all that. And one of the things that comes through really clearly in Will's book, but also comes through very clearly in history, is if you really want to destroy a human being, totally and utterly destroy them, humiliate them, and give them no avenue to come back. So Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, he knew that. And one of his great lines was, you've got to build your opponents a golden bridge with which they can retreat across. And so like this stuff is, it's if you study history and you study thinkers, this goes all the way back to Lao Tzu, to Sun Tzu, it's everywhere. It's in Emerson, which made me think of him. That man is a god in runes, right? That's his quote. And so like if you really just take the time, and we're going to get into libraries in a minute here, but like you can do it, and you don't even need to physically go to a library anymore. The amount of free things available to us all on the internet is just a unbelievable miracle, right? And if you want to be cynical, you could say, yeah, and that's why people watch 20 hours of cat videos, right? But like, you don't have to. Like, nobody's forcing you to do that. But another thing you get in to, which I wanted to move to next, which is that many of us have this kind of, and it references back to your tyrant, internal tyrant, this authoritarian chokehold, right? That presumably we think we have on ourselves. I wonder whether that is ourselves, or what is that like instilled in us when society is trying to make us fit into that round or square hole. They want to cut off our edges. You see it. It's one of the reasons I'm so interested in childhood education. We're doing it all wrong, in my opinion. Learning should be fun. Learning should be play. I'm a huge fan of Africa and have been several times. And when you watch animals in the wild, like especially the lions, right? What they do most of the time is play or sleep. That's what they do. And so the idea that we can't go, we might learn something from this. And Pink Floyd's The Wall, and which is very anti the conformity enforcing. But you get to something that I believe deeply, and that is we are essentially emotionally driven creatures. I call us domesticated primates, right? And human OS, we're all running human OS, all of us. There are no exceptions, unless there's aliens here that I don't know about. And I believe that if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, the one emotion that binds them all is fear. We are a fear-driven species, and we are especially afraid of novel fears, right? And one of the things that I think about when I think about this is like, when you accept that statement that we are fear-based creatures, all of the rest of it starts making sense, right? I don't want to fuck up. I don't want to appear like I'm an idiot. I don't want to appear ill-informed. I don't want, and so in my writing, I refer to manufactured gym. Manufactured gym is the gym that prepares the face to meet the faces that I meet, right? And so the destruction of manufactured gym became like my primary focus for a long time. How did you get beyond that?
I think one of my things that I came to is that it's so tricky because the moment you think you're certainly beyond it, like you're back a little, maybe not at the start, but like it's a trap. It's a trap when you think you're done, right?
Never done. And it's never done.
Yeah. So I have a tweet that's like, the first step to not being an unintegrated wannabe is to accept that that's what you are and see like the humor and grace and humility in that, right? So when you accept that, I'm just some guy, I'm trying my best, but it's not great, but it's fine, And Alan Watts had this great phrase that initially I thought was crazy. I thought it was depressing and terrible. He said, the reason you want to be better is the reason why you're not. And he was laughing about it and he was cheerful. And I was like, that's so bleak. You're telling me that I want to improve, but I can't improve because I want to improve. Like, that's so cruel. Like, how? But now I'm starting to see the humor in it. The humor is, and it just goes back to what we were saying earlier about the most heroic thing you can do is not hate yourself. Because when your desire to improve yourself is from like authoritarian kind of, you better be better or else kind of perspective, then you have designated yourself as a mistake. Now, this ties back to the music thing. When you've designated yourself as some kind of mistake that needs to be corrected, you're also going to trigger an internal resentment against yourself. And so there's this increasing tension and you're just fighting yourself all the time. And like, you can't fight yourself into peace, right? Like you have to put the gun down. And yeah, so your question was kind of how did I get to where I am? Man, I've struggled, and I have been updating my own internal narratives about what my life has been. I would say there were stories from when I was a teenager when I like bungled some friendships and like I was just clueless, said whatever I thought and got into trouble for that. Made all kinds of wrong assumptions. And by the time I was like 21, 22, I was beating myself up a lot inside. I'm like, I made all these mistakes. I'm so incompetent. I'm so terrible. I need to fix myself. And that was when I was listening to Alan Watts and I was like, wait, he's telling me that all these things that I'm doing, which are not working, it's not working because I'm trying to do the thing. It's like this paradox kind of thing. And I kind of lost it for a while. I remember being very depressed when I was about 25-ish, which was kind of, I would say, my second or third dark night of the soul. And it was the worst because I was an adult. I had bills to pay. So I would be depressed and I had to go to work. Right? But yeah, I think really my childhood love for books and music really saved me. I think that was the beacon in the light throughout. That was like, art still exists, literature still exists, music still exists. It has always existed. There has always been this nurturing space of and even those creators, they weren't perfect. They were also human beings, but they tried to embody some kind of loving. So like, I agree completely that fear is the main thing, and like the antidote is love, basically. Or like, there are two light and dark forces throughout mankind, right? All history. And fear is always more, it's violent, it's fast, it's decisive, it's aggressive. You can win by playing dirty. Whereas love is always, it's more subtle, it's slow, it's just people having conversations with their friends. Whenever I watch a video that comes across my feed that's like, oh, someone's like attacking someone else in a diner. And it's like horrible, like, oh my God, what's going on? The world's going to hell. But every day, billions of people sit down for dinner and nothing happens. We just don't see videos of that, right? And so that's the kind of conflict. But anyway, yeah, for me, I guess I just, I got married very young. I was 22, and I wanted to be a good husband to my wife. That's a big part of it. Yeah, and I regretted, the mistakes that I made when I was younger, and I wanted to do better. And yeah, I just, in times of reflection, I guess, whenever I was on the train on the way to work every morning, I'd be like, what's this for? It can't just be I'm just paying the bills for 30 years and then I'm old, and then, like, I have to find some peace in myself. And there's a great David Foster Wallace speech, This is Water, where he's talking about, and I remember I was listening to that while I was on the train. It's a crowded train, and he's talking about somebody going to the supermarket after work and they're struggling and the wheels going off and everything looks like death. And I'm like, oh man, that is the struggle, right? And I was thinking about, like, when I was younger, I've seen all these kind of like older men who are like bitter and like they're drinking and they're complaining about the government and they're complaining about society. And I'm like, I never want to end up like that. That seems like death. Or it seems worse than death in a way, right? It seems just bleak and sad. And it occurred to me while I was struggling with going to work, right? And I love my job. I had a great boss, You've met Dinesh, she's amazing. Right? So I had great colleagues, great work environment, and yet I felt this sadness and despondence in me that, like, what is my life? And so I just kind of resolved to, if I can survive this ordeal of living, right? If I can make it through with my musician slash artist literature heart intact and keep love afloat in this, this great sea of darkness, very dramatic, then I would have lived a good life. I really felt that I was very dramatic and I still am. I can still get very, kind of extreme about these things. But yeah, it just became clearer and clearer to me that is the central, again, like we see it in movies as, good versus evil, dark side, light side, Aragorn's people, Frodo versus Mordor. And it's all the same, it's dramatized kind of mirrors of what our internal conflicts are, right? Like our own, inside each of us, there are two wolves, right? There's like are you gonna still try and keep love alive when you can, like if you live with like anger and wrath and all of those emotions, there is a seduction to it. Things become easier in a way. Like if you never expect anything, you're never wrong. Or if you expect the worst from people, like there's just that, like there's a certainty to the dark side, right? And yeah, I guess I was just, at some point that just became the dominant thing on my mind, and I was determined to be on the side of light.
Which is great. And I think it's really helpful for people to hear that, because a lot of people, you talk a lot about scenes, and we're going to get to that in a minute. I mean, like I joked on Twitter before we started recording. I said,
can talk all day.
What are the chances are that we're going to be talking tomorrow at this time? Because like you hit so many themes that I care very deeply about. And it's difficult if you don't want to be an authoritarian, right? I'm like, if there is one characteristic that really defines me, is I'm fiercely anti-authoritarian.
Nice.
And to the point where I will like do the opposite if somebody tries to tell me what to do. Fuck you. I'm gonna go and absolutely do that. And so I think that helped me in understanding that you can't change another human. I don't think.
Yeah.
I think you can like point the way, right? You can be an example, right? You can do all those things, but that person has to want to change. And and by the way, back to Alan Watts, it's like, you know, his whole thing, I love him. And like I've watched many of his speeches and things. And he's like, the quote you used is one of my favorites actually. And it's kind of like, you know, what is this trying to improve? The reason that you're trying to do that is that you don't understand that you're fine, right now. And like Jed McKenna again, he's like, you know, what we all are is this little unique bit of spiritual DNA. But what then he goes on to say, what we really are is the flaw in the prism that expands from us, right? And so that kind of acknowledges everyone's unique, absolutely, but there's a lot of ways that unique people, ideas, etc., can work together, right? And instead of opposing. I've found that like one of the worst things in people that I've encountered, I've employed a lot of people, I've worked with a lot of people, but like if you are a fundamentally dark, pessimistic person, you just you're the chances that you're going to have a good life are virtually nil. Now, I always say virtually because hey, there's a chance, right? It's a low one though. And I also kind of came and I probably shouldn't take credit for this. Maybe it's just in my nature, right? But one of your cures is also one of my cures. And that is lighten up, right? Like, I love how you talk about humor, levity, frivolity being the cure. And I so passionately believe that. So tell me how you came to that, because it's such great advice.
Oh, and it's such every authoritarian hates comedians, right? They hate even all the way back to jesters and kings and stuff. Like the idea of, and so this, I have quote John Cleese in that, where he talks about how you can be serious, you can discuss serious matters, but you don't have to be solemn, right? You don't have to be like, have this grave sense of importance. And, you know, again, like a lot of tyrants, I love the idea that tyrants are like drama queens. You know, there's this great, I don't know if it's I don't know the full context of it, but there's like this movie, I think, called Springtime for Hitler.
Yes,
and
that's the producers. It's the producers.
Oh, the movie's called The Producers, and in that movie, they produce a show called Springtime for Hitler.
Right, exactly.
And they present Hitler as this theatrical, crazy, and I just enjoy that idea that tyranny is always like a kind of production. And this was played out beautifully in Andor, the latest Star Wars TV show that everyone says is great, and I agree. And they say, you know, there's this idealistic character who writes like a manifesto, and he says things like, you know, tyranny takes effort. You know, it's freedom is the natural expression of humankind, but like tyranny requires surveillance and vigilance and forces, and you need all this effort to preserve this static order, this kind of static self-image, this static configuration of society. Whereas like it's natural, babies laugh, you know, like one of the first things, every child is laughing all the time. And because they don't take themselves so seriously, they don't take anything so seriously. And if you haven't laughed in a while, that's a sign something's not right. You know, it's and you know, you see, I love how the rubber duck has become like a protest symbol in many different parts of the world. Like again, like so you just put like a authoritarian leader, and then you put like the rubber duck next to him, and instantly it's just it looks silly, and it takes the piss, right? Like it says we don't respect your authority in that sense. And you know, a good king. So I have this mental mental model thing about what a good king is like. And you know, take someone like Aragon, right? Or in who's the other guy in? I mean, just any good king understands that people need to laugh and people need to breathe and have fun. And anybody who cannot stand being made fun of, you know, they are insecure in some way. And, you know, maybe it's a tragic thing, like maybe they're trying to do good, but then you laugh at them and it hurts them in some way and they're not, you know, that can be a kind of tragedy. But, you know, at the extreme end, humor is like the canary in the coal mine. You know, when your laughter has died, you know something's really wrong. And if you can laugh, if, you know, whatever you're struggling with, if you can still laugh, you're still doing okay. Like you everything else in your life might be going to shit. But if you can still laugh, you have some, you can breathe, you can and you know, we used the phrase, oh, he cracked me up. right? I'm like, and what is being cracked up? It's the edifice that we've manufactured. Like you said, we manufacture this very careful, rigid thing that doesn't deviate from the script. And then someone says something and we laugh and we're like, oh, okay, you got me, fine. Let's now we can talk like real people, right? And that's just it's such a beautiful and simple idea.
And a wonderful one as well. I'm a huge fan of comedy. Mark Twain said, "Against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand." And
Yeah.
basically what he was getting at was this. I did a salon for intellect.
Nice.
Anna is a good friend of mine, and she's actually on my advisory board here at OSV. And
Nice.
um, the idea of the Russian fool, which is an archetype in Russian history, which is the holy fool they leave alone. It's a bit like the court jester, right? Because the holy fool can be a truth teller, and they won't
Yes.
get him killed, right? It's like he can call the emperor naked, and so the importance of comedy to me is like it's sacrosanct. It's right up there with music
Yeah.
and
Agreed.
poetry and literature because it also underlines the fact that tyrants are children. They're
Yes.
literally stunted humans.
Yes.
And they want to impose their will on everyone else. What does a child want to do? What does a toddler, the terrible twos, what do they want to do? They want to do what they want to fucking do, mom and dad. And they're going to act out unless I get my way, right? Like,
Yeah.
so tyrants are children. And if
Yes.
you could understand that and kind of introduce humor into it, but you also have to be really careful, right? Like, so Billy Wilder said, if you're going to tell people the truth, you better be
Make them
funny
laugh. Yeah.
or else they'll kill you,
Yeah.
right?
That's
So
true.
so
Yeah.
truth telling is very difficult in many respects, but
It is.
like I love comedy. My youngest daughter is a stand-up comedian, for example.
Nice.
And all she does is make fun of me when she's with me. She doesn't do me publicly in the act.
Nice.
But it's really great because it's
Yeah.
so funny, and laughter, I think, is a wonderful thing. Norman Cousins, I think, is the name of the guy who got a terminal diagnosis and checked himself out of it's called Anatomy of an Illness. And what he did was he checked himself out of the hospital, took a really sweet, beautiful hotel suite. And back then, I don't even think he had access to maybe videos. But anyway, he said, I just want every video I watch to be a comedy. And all he did was sit in that room, watch comedies all day long, and he literally went into remission. And so like the power of laughter is amazing to me. But then also comedians, right? Like Ricky Gervais, Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock. These are, look at their eyes. They sparkle with intelligence. And like, but they also, at least from my perspective, really, really funny people had a dark side because they're able to, and I think with most of them it's been integrated, right? But not always. But the power of laughter, the power of not taking yourself so goddamn seriously all the time. It's just like I love the writer Robert Anton Wilson, and he has a quote that's like, you have no idea the power of cheerfulness. And he goes, when a cheerful person walks into a room, he or she brings the entire room up. And conversely, when a very negative, puritanical tyrant enters the room, it just brings the mood way down. And so I completely agree with your view on that. And but how do we, a practical question, right? Like how do you demonstrate to others, because we can't change them, right? But how do you demonstrate to others that that's okay? And
Yeah.
is it educate me.
Well, so again, I don't think I'm qualified, but I'll try. it goes back again to the heroic thing is to not hate yourself, right? And it's to be willing to poke fun at yourself, basically. I mean, especially if you're like higher status than the other person or of equal status. So there is a so self-deprecation I am not a fan of, like 99% of the time, unless it's really like the one example I point at is I think Jennifer Lawrence. She was like an Oscar winner and she was speaking to somebody and she was making fun of herself, but it's obviously from a position of, she knows her worth and she cares about it. So from that point of view, self-deprecation can be great. You take yourself down a bit, everyone's equal. But like generally speaking, I think being able to poke fun at whatever it is that you're doing. So anything that you're doing, right, is always within some frame, right, within some context. Like you're working really hard to do something, so like the game I'm playing on Twitter sort of is I'm a bit of a preacher man, a bit of a let's all be, optimistic and golden and shoot for the stars together and be golden. I really believe that stuff. Like I believe it all the way in my heart, all the way down to my gut, everything. But I can't be too serious about it. Like I have to acknowledge that, hey, Ozymandias, right? Like everything eventually decays into nothingness. Every self-important preacher is also a clown, right? Every crown is also a theater prop, except that when the king or queen of England wears it, we take it seriously, and when it's someone on stage, we're like, oh, that's a theater prop. It's the same thing. It's just that we have a lot more people believing in that, but similarly, so just kind of to be able to say, hey, my crown is a theater prop. I don't take myself that seriously. Like I mean, I take my work seriously, but you don't have to take yourself seriously. So yeah, being able to laugh at yourself, that's probably the main thing. How else do you demonstrate? I think you're just having fun. It's funny to be. It's an interesting question to think about. How do you demonstrate it? It's really in the little things, right? So the tricky thing is someone who's very uptight about wanting to not be uptight might put on this performance, and then when people don't laugh, they get upset or something like that. It's tricky. So it's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. It's how you deal with failure. It's how you deal with things not working out. And that's hard. I think a bunch of it is also just telling the truth, apologizing when you get it wrong. And yeah, I think that's about it broadly.
Yeah.
It's as simple and difficult as that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's simple but not easy, right?
Exactly.
Like a lot of things in life. And when I was listening to you just describe it, and the whole idea of people being stiff, like there's an imagery from the Tao that essentially basically says, stasis is death. Only movement is life. Life is
Right.
is constant becoming, right? And it is a never-ending movement. And I'm a huge fan of the Tao Te Ching, and the metaphors they use in there, because it's, by the way, was not a single author, right? Like Lao Tzu means honored one, old one, master, those things. I'm sure it was a collective effort, but he uses the metaphor of water being flowing constantly. And yet then he goes on to say, water can wear away the hardest surface. It can go right through rocks. It can do all of those, which also suggests persistence. Yeah. And I also think about the whole, the tyrant, right? There's a great passage in the Tao Te Ching, which is the worst leader rules by fear, is feared. The next best tries to make everyone like him or her. The absolute best leader is one where something is accomplished and the people say, look at what we did by ourselves, right? Yeah. And so I just so believe that. But then like for people who push back on me, they're like, oh, well, that's easy for you to say, O'Shaughnessy. You don't have to like work for another boss or, well, okay, true enough, but I had to, at least in one part of my career. And so I always joke, like my major effort in life was to make myself totally unemployable, which I think I've accomplished, by the way. And so the idea that like some people get really kind of frightened by that. And so you write a lot about, maintaining agency and sovereignty. Like, again, just like you had me at hello on all of the stuff that you write, and I think do a fabulous job of writing. But like, how how do you interact with people who mean something to you, right? Who do you love, who are part of your life, and like they start judging you, and they start like saying, Visa, man, come on, what are you doing? And like you're just asserting your agency and your idea that you're you, right? How do you how do you do that?
So it depends on the person, but I often agree with their judgments. That's the usually that's the case. And I took dressing from this from David Ogilvy, who wrote. He's a fantastic writer with a lot of taste
Yeah,
and
it's
charm and
amazing.
wit and everything. And he wrote a couple of things that I just admire so much. One was when he kind of broke up with his business partner, so they had a split. He said something like, I can't. I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, I trust that he will assault to greater heights now, unencumbered by an insufferable, wretch such as me, something like that. And just that will. So there's a thing in which people who are judgy, right? Like they will say things like, "Oh, you're so." What? Let me try to think of something people have said that kind of actually hurt maybe. Um, well, so yeah, there was a time where people would say things like, "Oh, you take yourself so seriously, but you're just a poster or something," and I would be like, "No, I'm not. I'm trying to do something great." And then I realized, wait, like it's like what you were saying, right? Like there's some truth to it, which is why it's distressing. And I'm like, what if you just agreed? So like this conversational judo. What if we just embrace them and be like, yes, I am just a street musician, pastor. I'm busking on the internet telling people to be kinder to each other. That's what I do. It's simple. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Yeah, it varies depending on the judgment. Some of the trickier ones are things like, oh, you are hurting people with what you do, which it's I know myself well enough, and I've had enough conversations with enough people to trust myself, and I trust people to tell me if I'm doing anything really messed up. But for the most part, it's like, well, am I really the worst influence you can think of on the internet, right? That kind of thing. So if you agree too much with a really misplaced criticism, then it seems off. But a lot of the like my mom will say things like, so my mom's always wondering when I'm going to go to university because I never went. And I'm like, well, mom, I'm not gonna do that. I'm sorry to disappoint you. And I am genuinely sorry that, because from her point of view, in her worldview, she's like, oh, you gotta go to university. It's like a life stage that, I've kind of deprived her of that graduation photo moment. And I get that it's like sad for her, for example. But I can be like, well, I'm trying my best, and to do the thing that I want to do. And that's kind of the vibe. The vibe is like yeah, I mean, do you want to get specific about other kinds of judgments or anything? Because I do think this is something that I was not skilled at before. I became more skilled at it over time, and people have told me sometimes that witnessing how I kind of judo people who like
That was
come
the
at me
exact
belligerent.
reference I was going to make. So keep going.
Yeah, like when people come at me kind of belligerently, and I don't always do it perfectly, but when I do it smoothly, people DM me saying, "Oh wow, that was so cool how you handled that person. I'm stealing that for my bag of tricks the next time I get a heckler," right? Oh, there's this great conversation with Jerry Seinfeld and Barack Obama at
Yeah,
in
I've
Comedians
seen
in
it. I
Class Getting
love it.
Coffee,
I love
right?
it.
And so Obama asks Seinfeld, "What's your theory of hecklers?" And then Seinfeld says, I said, "You know what? You seem upset. I'm sure you didn't mean to come here and have a like how are you doing? What's up with you, right? Like you seem upset. What's going on, right?" And sometimes if the person is being belligerent, they're not used to being listened to. Usually, I think that's a common thing. I think very often people who are like, "Oh, you're not," like they're complaining and they are used to their complaints falling on deaf ears. So when you're actually like, "Oh, okay, tell me more. What's going on?" They are like, "What? What's going on?" Like, and you can sometimes you even have a good conversation. I've had friendships develop from, so not every time, but like maybe one in a dozen times when someone is being kind of like disagreeable and belligerent at me online, and I'm like, "What's going on? Let's talk about it. Maybe you're right. Like tell me more." And then we become friends afterwards because they had assumed that I'm someone that I'm not, and then I surprised them, and then yeah, I don't think that's realistic to kind of expect everyone to have the patience to do. So probably, if it's some random stranger online, just ignore them. If it's a loved one, that's trickier. And I would say, yeah, try to assume that from whatever their perspective is, which you don't have full insight into, from whatever their perspective is, whether or not they're right or wrong, they think that doing what they're doing is the right thing to do, right? So like that's a puzzle, right? It's an interesting, like, okay, you're yelling at me, like it's not fun, but what's going on? Why are you saying that? Like, I think if you can find a way to bring curiosity to that interaction, which can be very difficult if it's like someone's yelling at you, but if you can find a way to be genuinely curious, I think it's quite disarming.
I agree, and I was thinking of so many things as you were talking. Like, there's a meme that I often put up with the guru sitting on top of the mountain, and the guy comes up to ask him the question, and he says, how are you so peaceful? And he goes, never argue with idiots. And then the next panel of the meme is the guy says, that's stupid, that's wrong. And then the guru says, I agree entirely.
That's yeah.
Which I think is great.
It's
And
perfect.
so
Yeah.
I also think the other reason that we're so simpatico on this is I agree with the idea that when you look at somebody who's coming at you aggressively, right? You need to open your mind to the fact that there's something bothering them. There's something, like you used a good term. They feel like they're not being heard. And so sometimes, normally what I normally do, if you could just tell, you can tell pretty much from phrasing, whether this person is just a troll, right? And we're going to get into assholes later because you write very convincingly about that. But so if it's that case, I ignore, do not engage, because they're psychic vampires. They want to suck the energy out of you, and like I view that as just a stunted development, and some other things. But you bring up the great point. I don't know. I don't know what. Maybe they just had a horrible day, right? And maybe they had a series of bad things happen in their life, and they see whatever you put up online and they lash out at you. And so if you remain open-minded about the idea that, let's see, right? And then you engage, and you're right. Maybe it's 1 out of a dozen times. But I too have had situations like you described where the person came at me really, really hard. And like, you're wrong. This is stupid. This is, why would you ever do that? And then like I had heard of this person, and I'm like, I think I'm going to engage on this. And the one of the things that I found works really well is just ask questions. What, why? Why do you think that?
Mhm.
And then just keep going down. Just keep saying why. And
Yeah.
what's really interesting about that is they you've been actively listening to them, and they can see that. But B, they're being heard. And so many people have this idea, like, that they're unheard, right? And just leaning into, and I love the Aikido reference there, or martial arts reference. I think when you um I really dislike judgmental people. And look, I just admit that freely.
Yeah.
And but one of the things that I find is, I look at it, I use a photographic metaphor, right? So is your aperture open wide, or is it closed? Is your aperture really closed? If your aperture is opened wide, you become, much almost by definition, you're less judgy, because you're open to the fact that maybe I'll learn something here. Maybe I'll be able to synthesize something I've had taken from this conversation. There's always a way to interact, in my opinion, that,
Yeah.
like, excluding loathsome assholes, right?
Right.
Like like the whole thing around, I actually wrote it down as I was preparing for you, and the amount of pages of notes I have on you, man, you are amazing. But it was a quote from a show that I liked on TV called Justified, and the protagonist is a U.S. Marshal, and his name is Ryland Givens, and they give him the best lines and everything. And one of his lines is, if you run into an asshole in the morning, you ran into an asshole. If you run into assholes all day long, you're the asshole. So, like, any more hints on like how to helpfully either engage or disengage? And what do you do when you decide, you know what, this is one that I don't want to jump into this dark hole?
Yeah, so a thing that I do, and I love your idea of the aperture, and I have a couple of riffs that fit perfectly with that. One is that there's always a move, which is the same thing you're saying. The other thing is that if you to play longer games, right? And again, so if the only game in play is this immediate interaction, then you can feel like, oh, I'm either going to win or lose or ignore it. But if you zoom out and you see the big picture and you're like, oh, I am pursuing this interest for decades, right? There's a thing that I care about, I want to communicate, then I am going to encounter misunderstandings repeatedly. So I have the tweet that says like, all my haters are my collaborators, right? Which is that they don't realize, because they are in a moment of anger, their aperture is small. They're in a moment of anger or frustration, they're going to say a bunch of stuff. And I'm like, well, how can I use this volunteer, right, to just flesh out information that I can then use later on? And so I have written stuff that's like built on addressing the misunderstandings that people have. So I know that I might not like convert this particular person at this particular point in time, but whatever issues or grievances or interpretations they have, they are probably not the only person who has it. Maybe even more reasonable people have similar concerns and grievances. So I list out, so like one of the things I got from there's a period of time I had a parody account dedicated to me, which was fun. He was around for like 8 months, and he would rephrase my tweets in like absurd ways. And it was interesting. I was actually enjoying it because he was paying such close attention to my stuff. And he was like distorting it in a very specific way. And he was revealing his own biases in his distortions. He assumed that I care about like money to a degree that I don't care about. He assumed just a bunch of stuff. And I actually took screenshots and I made a list of notes so I didn't want to engage with him moment to moment because I knew that it would just be a messy fight and I wouldn't be happy, he wouldn't, whatever. But I kept tabs on everything he said and I reworked some of those things where I would address, and you might be like, some people say X and some people say Y, and my answer to that is XYZ. So instead of responding to that one angry person, like you kind of use it as an educational opportunity, right? And not necessarily directed at that person. And I do find that, there's an emotional surge when someone's coming at you and you feel an urge to defend yourself. And I like to think of it as, again, I'm transmuting that energy. I'm not going to win this guy, but I can win the next 50 guys like him by writing the relevant thing so that next time when someone says X, I already have a thread about X. So and so on. And I find that very gratifying. And, I've now that I know that that's my style, like I can feel a lot more at peace the next guy that comes along.
Yeah, that's great advice. And it kind of figures into your thread on good reply guys, right? Mm-hmm. Which I love. I actually wrote a thread on Twitter about like how not to be a reply guy. Like like I consider Twitter a confederacy of duchies, right? So there's fin twit, there's film twit, there's art twit, there's and like if I was going to barge in on architecture twit, right? And say all modern architecture is bullshit, it sucks, it's awful. Well, okay, it's not my passion. I love architecture, but like these people, it's their true passion, and they like to have great in-depth conversations about it. And it's you driving a car right through their front door, right? And it's very destructive. And kind of my solution was have good manners. Like I never thought that I would see a day where having good manners was an asymmetric advantage. When I was young, my mother beat manners into me. right? It was just like, no, no, no. And, even around things like humor, my mom took me aside. I was very funny when I was younger. And like my mom, I was interacting with friends and she kind of did it perfectly. She waited until all my friends were gone. And then she goes, come here for a minute. And I went, sure. And she goes, I overheard what you are really funny, Jim. You are really a funny kid. And I'm like, well, thanks, Mom. And she goes, I want to ask you to think about something. And I said, what's that? And she said, you often use humor as a weapon. And I'm like, what, what do you mean? And she goes, humor. And then she kind of went into the thing we just discussed a bit about like Mark Twain, and like she was just so switched on. But I never forget that conversation because, like, yeah, you know what? As I reflected on it, I was like, you're right. And so
Mm.
one of her rules was, if you're telling dirty jokes, if it's funnier than it is dirty, you can go ahead and tell it.
Right.
If it's dirtier than it's funny, shut up.
Right.
And then she was like, learn to be a little more gentle in
Mm.
your humor. She's like, you're good at teasing, but back off. Like, because she said, you're really good at going for the big red button on the person and pushing it.
Mm.
And maybe you shouldn't do that. It, the reason I thought of that was your reply, like the way you engage with people
Mm.
and everything. Have you ever
Right.
found that, like, um, there's and by the way, I love the thinking. Don't think about that specific person. Think about
Mm.
the group, the longer term,
Right.
the
Yeah.
longer advantage. But are you ever confronted by people who like come after you because I want you to teach me and you're not teaching me. Has that ever happened to you?
I've it's not that specific flavor. I think you probably get more of that when you have like higher status and capital and all those things. But I have had similar, kind of similar, where they're asking me, they're requesting something, and the way in which they are requesting it makes me not want to do it. And then here's an interesting one. Somebody once said, um, it would make my whole week or something if you did a video call with me. And here's someone who like hasn't actually replied to any of my tweets before, and I could do it. It's a small thing to do, but I didn't feel like doing it. And I've video called random people for fun now and then. But there was something about that thing where he was kind of, I guess my interpretation is that he was kind of pedestalizing me, and like he wanted that you know that access to someone else that he felt was something. And I could have used that as a teaching opportunity, but I didn't want to. I just kind of ignored it. But yeah, I think so like so this is kind of like almost like level 2 or level 3 kind of thing where, okay, we already know all the right moves you can possibly make, or like all the best possible move in each situation. Now you also have to sit back and look at your life. And I have seen certain instances where I could probably help this person, but it would take me like 3 hours, and I don't have 3 hours today, and I'm sorry, like I have to spend time with my spouse, I have to spend time with on my main thing. So the unfortunate limitations of time and space mean that I can't devote myself entirely to every single person who wants help. And one of the ways I addressed that was I have a blog post. I have two blog posts. One blog post on how to ask for help, and I'm like, like list out your considerations, blah blah blah. I have another blog post on how to get my attention. So it's like, if anybody is actually interested in actually having a conversation, like I've laid all my stuff out. It's very easy to navigate and find. So if someone's like bypassing all of that, to me, it's like, oh, you just didn't, you didn't meet my filters. And it's not like it's a secret, obscure filter. You just didn't care at all. And so, yeah, I basically just ignore those people. And I'm pretty lucky, I guess, that I haven't yet encountered like stalkers or like people who are just very persistent and fixated. Apart from my parody account, which is kind of funny. But yeah, if someone wants me to, I've also encountered people who they were nice to me at first, like in my mentions, for example, and then when I like don't recognize their brilliance, they turn on me sort of, and then they get mad. And I've also seen it play out long enough that some people I've seen, they've turned once and then they turn back in like a year or 2 years. And I have a weirdly good memory for this kind of thing. Like I just kind of recognize people and I'm like, oh, this guy used to say nice things to me and then he used to be mean and then now he's nice again. Like, okay, that's like whatever you are dealing with, bro. Like, I'm the same guy I've always been since I was a teenager. But yeah, I don't know if I have any good suggestions for that. It's just you have to roll with it.
It also comes into your assholes idea where you say assholes are maybe like 1% of any group, right?
Mhm.
Most normal people I've certainly experienced, and when this really resonated with me when I read it, because I'm like, yeah, he's right. It's like assholes are generally a tiny part of the population. But then you go on to say, but they cause 75% of the damage in the group and they ruin the experience for everybody. It's kind of like that's cliche because it's true. One bad apple spoils the entire barrel.
Cool.
So how do you have that no asshole rule? And how do you, for being a non-authoritarian like myself, how do you enforce it? How do you enforce it?
Yeah, it's very tricky. It's very tricky. So if you're starting your own group or your own, so again, if it's your house, it's the easiest. Just don't invite assholes to your house. That's very easy. But as you scale up and up, right? If you're talking about running a community club or like or you have a scene where it's a kind of open-ended scene, open air scene, and you can't control, right? It's so tricky. There's layers to it. My first principle is make sure you have people around you that have healthy norms and can look out for each other, like kind of eyes across the room. You guys are seeing this, right? This is kind of weird. And then so that's at the very least, if you can't do anything about it, you can like retreat to the good people. And then there's like concentric circles of increasing escalation. Like so, you may have to tell someone off sometimes, and in that case, try to be neutral, try to be firm. I'm always I have a rule for myself, which is that like I swear with my friends. If you see me saying "you fucking guy" in the replies to someone, we are definitely friends. Because if I don't like someone, I'm gonna be clinically polite so that they can like any problem they have with me cannot be like on the basis of how I'm talking to them. You have to earn like this my swears by being friends. And so I think that's a useful rule to have, like to be polite with your enemies. And when you frame it as like so some people are like, oh no, I want to swear, they deserve a few harsh words. Like true, but like if you game it out, right, you try it with a few different people. Once you've kind of gone down to their level, then they are justified in name calling back, and then it gets messier, whatever. I think generally speaking, the asshole problem is a coordination problem. It's not any one hero's job to fight an asshole 1v1. It's really about educating bystanders to coordinate a non-violent response. And so if you Google things like a bystander training or like good bystander things, there's a bunch of like interesting videos and stuff. So if let's say you're on a train and you see someone harassing, like an immigrant or a minority or someone, the thing to do is not to point at the person who is the aggressor and like tell them off because they want to fight. What you want to do is you want to disrupt the frame by going to the person who's being harassed and like literally disregard the person and be like, hey, how are you doing? How's your day? How's the weather? Have you had, do you have kids? Like whatever. And then you create this new frame where the asshole is kind of not a part of. And there's a one I love where there's a video of two people fighting on the train. And then you can see they don't even really want to fight. It's like two macho guys kind of bump into each other and they're like, hey, what? They're going to fight. And this third guy who's bigger than both of them, he's eating chips. He just kind of quietly walks in between the two of them and he starts eating his chips and like they both kind of like back off and the whole situation de-escalates. So yeah, it's about like de-escalation skills. I think it doesn't help for like the worst 0.001% extremely egregious like predator kind of asshole. But for like the disagreeable, annoying kind of like that kind of asshole, like yeah, you can kind of coordinate so if you see someone kind of being mean to someone else in a tweet, you can show up and just talk at the first guy and then just try to have a normal conversation. And then it just kind of it makes the asshole look unreasonable and weird and kind of and again, like, one of the people's biggest fears is kind of being ostracized or being like if you're an angry guy and people are fearing you, that's the theatrics of that drama production is the angry guy has the power. But if one angry guy is ranting and two other people are having an interesting, pleasant conversation, now the angry guy looks silly and he looks weird and awkward. They'll tend to like kind of go out. So that's like one possible play. And the tricky thing is you kind of have to adapt the situation. So if you're trying that play and it's not working out, if you keep forcing it, you might look stupid. So it's like, you have to, there's a few different things like this you have to try. And I hesitate to kind of give simple instructions, but it's things like you really have to return to the norms that you want. And if someone is being like kind of name calling or insulting people's appearance or just be like whatever it is that is unacceptable behavior, generally again it varies so much depending on the context, but generally I try to it's what I just described. Like, I try to reorient the conversation in a healthy way, or like, and sometimes if you can like lock the thing or turn it off or switch it to another thing, like if that's possible, that's great. Like the equivalent of if there's a bar fight, you turn on the lights and you turn off the music and whatever, like that kind of vibe. And then you try and bring it back, and then so my favorite band is Paramore, and they do really great, like the way they stop fights is very nice. And so Haley is a singer. She's like, y'all are at this show and you're fighting. Like, this is a place for love, and like, don't make me be like a lecturer. I don't want to be like a school mommy, discipline mistress or whatever. Like, we're here to dance and have fun. You like, and then you can kind of it takes some confidence to like direct people around. Like, you guys make sure that person's okay. Like, you come on, get to the other side of the room. All right, we're here to have a good time. Okay, and then it continues. So there is a skill to that. It takes some confidence and assertiveness. But yeah, I don't know if that's enough, but it's a big problem.
That's actually great advice. I love the idea of de-escalation. I think that works really, really well. I especially like your idea behind, do not go to the person who's causing the problem. Go to the person who they are harassing, right? And I've done that many, many times. And it's got a pretty good at batting average, because you can recreate the scene, if you will. But it requires, as you say, you have to be pretty confident to be able to do it. And you have to also have a healthy appreciation for the theatrical. And like when people would say to me, like, damn, you're good at Twitter, man. Like, you're so good at it. I'm like, Twitter's performance art, man.
Yeah,
and
it is.
If you don't understand that, that's going to be the thing that's going to really knock you off. The other thing you mentioned there, though, which I like very much because I totally agree with it, and that is this idea of putting people on a pedestal, right? And like, I really don't want that.
Yeah.
It's like, if you meet the Buddha in the road, kill him, because he's not the real Buddha.
Right.
And, it's all the Zen. Like, don't look at my finger, look at what it's pointing at.
Yeah.
And yet you also had a great solution or a comment, and then I'm going to get you to explain the idea. But you referenced Times Square here in New York. And like, I hate Times Square. I hate Times Square, but you made me rethink it. And I'm going to go back there after reading what you said, because like, you were like, look, Times Square, if you're looking at it kind of from a surface, it's glitzy and it's loud and it's like annoying and obnoxious. And that's kind of my feeling about Times Square. It's like, nobody who lives in New York actually goes to Times Square. But then what you said, which I really liked, is like, but if you go there, take the time to check out, because there's a lot of really cool things that you got to search a little bit for, but you'll find.
Right.
Talk about that for a little bit, because I love that. And you're actually going to drive me back to Times Square.
Yeah, that's funny. I haven't actually been to New York yet. I've been wanting to go all my life. I'm finally coming later this month, and I intend to pop by Times Square, at least, from halfway across the planet. You have to check it out. I mean, and yeah, so it's, and I was using Times Square as a metaphor, really. So it's not really about Times Square itself, but like
Of course, yeah.
about like algorithms and the internet, and whatever is loudest and most garish and anywhere gets most of the. So just as assholes cause most problems, like whatever is loudest gets most attention. And I think I was saying more of like be willing to check out what's like next door, or like one street down or two streets down, right? Like, and so even if, like, if you go to whoever is the most famous Twitch streamer, or the top 100 most famous Twitch streamers, their chats are so overflowing with responses. Nobody's reading it. It's like just a phenomenon. It's like noise. But at any time in your life, if you're feeling lonely, you can just go to Twitch, look for a streamer who has no views, be their one and only viewer, and say, "Hey, nice stream. How is it going?" And you will make their day. They will be so happy. They will stop playing to chat with you. And it's just so. And I sometimes do this kind of like, I'm not feeling good. Let's just go. And then I say something, and they're so happy. I get infected by their happiness. And I'm like, well, So it's like, I guess the idea there was really, instead of complaining about whatever you think is terrible and gets, so when you complain about the thing that's getting too much attention, you are contributing to the amount of attention it's getting, right?
Right.
And the best thing you can really do is, cool. Let me tell you about my favorite book. Let me tell you about my favorite movie, right? And when I was a teenager and I was in the local music scene, I was so frustrated at how much everyone was complaining all the time about pop music. Like, oh, the radio only plays pop music. Well, I'm like, well, you're talking about it, So again, it's the same thing. And I came to realize that my frustration with those people about their frustration, it continued in this loop where I'm still not doing what I want. And you know who solved this? Like 200, like Nietzsche, like Nietzsche. He figured it out like in the 1800s. He said, I only wish to be a yes sayer. No longer will I, negate the things that I dislike. I will not even, admonish those who negate. Like, I will simply look for things to say yes to, and I would just, make that my like prayer, or like my affirmation. Like, just look for things that you want and celebrate, and what you think is deserving of attention, and then just focus on that. And yeah, so my bio on Twitter says, focus your time and energy on what you want to see more of. And if you just think of everybody's utterances and their tweets and whatever, everything that we do, right, is I think Patrick McKenzie, Patio 11, he says something like, every dollar you spend is a vote for how you want the world to be, whether you realize it or not, right? Like, just, and same for everything you say and everything you direct attention to. So if you spend your time quote tweeting saying, this person sucks, or this is so terrible, no, I disagree, like, you're still feeding attention to those things. And so everyone should do like a personal audit. And it's worth scrolling. And we're all human, so we all probably once in a while get annoyed. It's normal. But like, I recommend everyone kind of scroll through your own timeline for a bit, like on your own tweets, and be like, are these the things I want to be recommending? And if it's no, then like, you gotta sit down and ask yourself why. What would you rather? What flames would you rather be fanning? Yeah.
I love that. One of my mantras is, I like to look for things to root for as opposed to against, because I'm a huge believer that you are what you pay attention to, what you surround yourself with, what you continue to assert, that you create that reality. And, again, Robert Anton Wilson, one of my favorites, and he stole it from Timothy Leary, it turns out, or who stole it from someone else. But this idea of reality tunnels or reality goggles, like,
Yes.
you have to understand that that what we think is reality is not reality. It is our semantic response to the very limited perceptions that are hitting our filters. Like, if you even think about the idea that we are horribly, woefully inadequate in seeing colors, we humans, right? And then you start thinking, well, certain animals only see in black and white. So thank God that we can at least see some of the colors, right? But if you try to change the frame of reference, a lot of really cool things can happen, I think. Now,
Yeah.
I knew that I would run into this problem because I have not even covered half of everything I wanted to talk to you about. And so I'm going to invite you back. I hope you will say
Wonderful.
yes.
Obviously, yes.
I want to get into, you have a great thing about culty bullshit. I love that. It's like, look up how to know if you're in a cult. I think that's such great advice. But we're going to save that for later. So first off, you like, I was right. I knew I was going to have so much fun with you.
Yeah.
I love what you're doing. I love the
Thank you
fact
so much.
that like it's just it makes an impression, right? And so sometimes like you can feel like, oh, not so great, not so great. And then all of a sudden, boom. And like that's requires long-term thinking. That requires a long-term plan. And I love the fact that you have and you've thought about all that. So, much respect from me. When we come your second time through, we'll talk about all these other really cool things because they're really cool, and I love your ideas on it. But
Thank you so much, Jim.
one of the things that I always do at the end, and you're going to get a chance to do it twice at least, is that we are going to make you emperor of the world for a day. You can't do anything authoritarian. You can't put anyone in re-education camps, and you can't kill anybody. But what I'm going to do is hand you a magic microphone, and you're going to be able to say two things into that microphone. And you're going to incept the entire 8 billion population of Earth. They're all going to wake up whenever their morning is the next morning, and they're going to think, I just had these two fantastic ideas, and I'm going to start acting, doing, pursuing that today. What two things that you would incept in people that you think would make things a lot better off for all of us?
Wow. Well, I have kind of my list of talking points, but I feel like I shouldn't just go with that. I should kind of feel out what I want to say. But so my default talking points, my big one is, I've said already, focus your time and energy on what you want to see more of. Which, I don't know if it has a megaphone bumper sticker like quality that I like. Like I might pick something else. Megaphone, all 8 billion. I guess the thing I would start thinking about that question is like, what are things that people kind of already know, but the problem is that there isn't consensus, meaning that not the reason progress is slow is not because people don't know it, but because people don't know that everyone else knows it, right? So, yeah, I'm tempted to be like, school is bullshit. Like everyone needs to know, like just to get consensus. I mean, I would want to think about it a bit more and like try and phrase it in a clever. So the underlying intent is to get everyone to rethink education, and I don't know if school is bullshit is the best way to say that, but I would workshop that a little bit, and maybe the next call I'll come up with a nice phrase. But school is bullshit, and the other thing that I think I would want everyone to do is something like so I want people to be more creative, and I want people like, and my thing is that if you think someone isn't creative, look at their excuses. So we're always making up excuses all the time. We're super creative when it comes to staying exactly where we are. Homeostasis is not like supernatural. Like it's not. It takes work to remain where we are. We have to say no to opportunities that would change our lives so that we stay where we are. So I don't know if that's the phrase I would use, but the second thing I would want to get people to think about other than education is I just kind of want to invite everyone to consider that the existing configuration they are in is not necessarily the configuration they have to be in. And I've seen this, every marriage is like this in some way, right? Like people just, and my funny story that I like to tell to explain this is I have this coffee shop downstairs from my house, and every day I used to get the exact same coffee, which is like less milk and some things. There's a specific order, and so we keep having that order. And one day I'm like, I want to try the different. So we usually just condensed milk, and I want to try the other milk. And like in trying to have that conversation with my coffee lady, it was confusing because like she doesn't, like, her English is not great. And so I was like, auntie, I don't want that. I want that. And it was just a bit of a mess. And I was just amused because that must be the case in so many configurations that we have a default setting and we just don't try something different. And so I guess, I want people to question defaults and give, more importantly, give each other space to like screw around and try something different. So it'll be something like, tomorrow when you wake up, tell someone, not necessarily a secret, but like, it's such a. I'm awestruck at the scale of the opportunities. But it's the principle. I'll just go with the principle. So the first one is like rethink education. School is bullshit. Like ask yourself what you really want to learn and know. And the other one is kind of give yourself and your companions, your peers, the gift of like presence to just allow each other to be different. Allow each other to okay. So it's like share with your friends and family and your like long-term friends or whatever a crazy idea that you've kind of been carrying but have been shy to share because it doesn't fit your default narrative, right? So there's a lot of words for both. It's a great prompt. I think I'm going to be thinking about this for a while and see if I can condense them into like a couple of tweets, because it would be so great if I already had a tweet. And yeah, but those are the things. So
I love them both. And, I always say, the only reason, by the way, I barely have a BA was because my mother said, you can do anything you want, but just please get a degree, please. Like,
yeah.
All right. All right. And I used to say to my mom when she was telling me this, I used to say, Mom, and this turns out it was a famous quote. I didn't know that at the time. But like, why do you want me to let school get in the way of my education?
Yeah, I remember that.
And like, so I still believe that. Learning is lifelong. It is not, yeah, I'm done. I got my little sheepskin here. I know everything there is to know, because we don't know like 1/10, we don't know half of 1% of everything there is to know. So I love that. And I love the be open to letting people change their default settings. It's the only way growth happens, right?
Yeah.
And like, I'm huge into this idea that movement, we are becoming, all of us, not just me, not just you, all of us are becoming. We are motion. Stasis is death. And if people understand, like, I know I've got to stay in my lane. I hate that phrase.
Yeah.
Like, I always reply to it with the car, like doing this, right?
Nice.
So this has been just tremendous. Thank you so much for being my guest, and for giving me your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.